Hey friends, thank you so much for joining. My name is Tabitha and I am the artist behind Box Hollow Studios. I am very excited to share with you today a video that I created painting a cactus. I walk you through all the steps, how I do my process. I do paint a little bit more tight than a lot of watercolor artists, so you may get to learn something a little bit more unique or something new today, which I hope you do. But please follow up with any comments or questions that you have, and I really hope you love this video. Alright, just a small caveat, you are going to get to hear Declan in the background today. He is with Dad over in the living room, so he'll be making an appearance here and there. So to get started, I have laid out my artwork right here. I've sketched out very lightly, just in regular mechanical pencil. I don't worry about having any type of special pencils, but I have the sketch laid out very lightly here. I have my paper towel. I usually get about 3, and I fold them up and then fold them in half, so it makes kind of a nice, thick palette for the water to absorb. And then I have a smaller piece of paper towel that I'll be using to blot and lift paint, and I'll explain a little bit more of that later. And then I have my palette right here, and then my reference photos are off to the side with my water at the top. So to get started, I'm going to start by dipping my paintbrush in the water, and I'm going to go right for that sap green. And I'm going to dip it in the paint. So the paints are dry. I don't ever use wet paint. I usually let them dry overnight. So I'm basically bringing them back to life. I'm getting my water and I'm pulling that paint till it's nice and thick and wet, and I'm bringing it off to this side over here onto a nice clean spot. In my reference photos, my artistic eye sees a little bit more of this blue green versus a yellow green. And so I'm going to be mixing in some of that blue green. This is actually called phthalo green. I think that's how you pronounce it. And then I'm also going to pull some of that ultramarine blue. And it's going to make this nice dark green over here. Okay, so I'm getting it nice and saturated. This is going to be one of the main colors that I use. So I'm basically mixing up this color to use throughout the painting. When I first lay paint on this painting, I want it to be very light. I work in very thin layers. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started on this part of the cactus, the very bottom, and I'm just going to go for it. I'm just going to go ahead and get some paint down. And as you see, I'm almost dotting the paint on. I never just paint flat strokes. I'm dipping my brush back in the water. I'm getting just a little bit of the edge where it's very watered down. See, this part is very saturated. This part is very watered down. And I'm just going to place this paint, and it's still almost too dark for my first layer. So I'm just going to dip it right back in the water, tap it off, and then I'm just going to use this paint that's on the paper. And I'm going to pull it around, just dotting it around here and there, leaving some white spaces. In the sketch that I drew, I don't know what you call them, where I guess you would see the spikes of the cactus, the needles of the cactus. I left these white circles. There aren't any circle or needles on this cactus, but there were these little circles. And so I'm going to leave those white for now, and I'm just painting around them, dotting the paint around them. So keeping my brush dry, not too dry and not too wet. Now I'm still pulling water, and I'm still using the paint on that's already down on the paper. Getting my first layer down. I usually paint anywhere between I would say 4 to 6 layers, with the very final layer being the details of the painting. So as you see, I've dotted that paint all over, and I did create this composition, so I'm using reference photos, but this is my own composition. But in my brain, I have that the light source is coming from the right. So the left side's going to be a little bit darker, right side's going to be a little bit lighter. But do you see how I have this nice variation for the base layer? It's not this flat color. It's nice and spotted, just like light. When you see light on an object, it's not one color. You see the various tones and various shades of the same color. So that's how my painting style, how I strive to make my painting style. Not flat, not too saturated, not all one color in one area, but various tones, various shades. So here we go to the next little part of the cactus. Again, you see the left side slightly darker, right side slightly lighter. Still using that very saturated, watered down paint. Going over on this side, working our way across the painting. So why I like to do this, why I work in layers like this, is because I start with the bottom, then I move up the painting, and by the time I go for the second layer, back down this direction, this part will be dry. And I like to let each layer dry for the most part. Sometimes I work with the layers of paint, and I like to use it to create some of those nice watercolor sprays. But for the purposes of this painting, for right now, I may do some of that later, but for right now, we're just going to work on letting each layer dry in between. I noticed that the left side of this was a little lighter than the right side, so I went back and added slightly more saturated paint. And then I'm going back to that lighter version. Now, as you can see, my pencil lines are so faint, I don't even know if you can see it in the video, but they're so faint, I rarely erase pencil lines because I barely put any pencil lines on the paper. I sometimes have to erase something if it's too dark. Like this looks a little too dark, I'll probably have to go back and erase that. But on the other hand, occasionally I'll purposefully leave pencil marks just because I think it adds a nice organic touch that this was created by a human with watercolors, especially since I paint a little bit more on the realistic side. I think it makes a nice, adds a nice touch sometimes, but not to overdo it with a bunch of pencil lines. Same technique, working my way across the cactus. Let's go back to the left side. Now in my reference photos, these, I wish I knew what these were called, these pieces of the cactus. But in the reference photo, you have some that are facing forward, some that are to the side. For the most part, I have left these all facing forward so that y'all didn't have to worry too much about the light source, because when you're changing, when different planes, when the light hits different planes in different positions, it'll be lighter and darker. But I wanted this to be a little bit more straightforward, so I made all the planes basically facing forward. This one's the only one that's a little to the side, and I'll probably make that one a little bit darker. Maybe lighter, I haven't decided yet. Okay, so this is pretty much dried. So I'm gonna go back down to this part of the cactus now that the first layer, the base layer, is down. And now that I see It's a little bit more of that yellow-green still, so I'm going to add some blue. I don't know what shade of blue this is. I will look it up and share that with you later. It's just a very, like a sea blue color. It's lighter than an ultramarine. So I'm going to see what this looks like on my painting. And again, I'm doing the same thing. I'm going back through. I'm still going around those white highlights, keeping it a little bit darker on the left side, a little lighter on the right side, and I'm pretty free with my brush strokes. Now you see, this might look different from other watercolor artists that you have watched in the past, because again, I'm controlling and keeping things a little bit more tight, because I do paint a little bit more realistic, and so I'm keeping things controlled. But I still, the reason that I'm painting in watercolor is because I love the effect of watercolor. So I'm still getting that by adding a little bit more water. And once I kind of get a hang of my colors and where this painting is going, you can even grab a little pigment and do some dotting of pigment onto the water to add some of those nice random color sprays. I don't do too much of that, but so see, my painting is very wet, and so when you add that pigment, it just spreads out and sprays, adding some nice movement and some nice interest to the painting. Still left these nice highlight spots. Create that color again with this sea blue and the green. And that was a little darker than I anticipated. So I'm going to take my little dab towel, and you see how it lifts off so nicely? When you keep your paint with enough water in it, it's easy to do that. If you add straight pigment, meaning less water, onto the painting, it's harder. It still can be done, and I might be able to demonstrate that in a little bit. But when you're working in these light layers, you can dab up that paint pretty easily. So there's our second part. Going to our next part of the cactus. Now as I get darker and darker, I'm going to start going back to my reference photo a little bit more and noticing and taking note of what I need to be doing next. And something that I see here that I probably need to account for is where the cacti meet each other, the little cacti planes. There is a little white highlight in there. So this is kind of an example. This is kind of my personality in a nutshell. I'm very spontaneous. I'm very spur of the moment. So sometimes I just go for things and don't plan enough. But I am going to go back because I do see that there's a little highlight. And I'm going to take my water. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. I'm going to take my water and I'm going to add water to this spot. Let it sit for a second. Add water to this spot. Let it sit for a second. Right there. And I'm going to take my dab rag and I'm going to lift the paint up. So I'm just going to press. You don't want to rub. The more you rub, the more at risk you are of tearing your paper. And I'm just picking some of the paint up. And I'll go back in a little bit. I'm not going to worry about it right this second because I'm going to let it dry. If you lift the paint like I just did and then immediately try to go back with paint and try to start doing things in that area, it can start to get muddy quick. So my suggestion is get your water, dab the paint, lift the paint up, and then let it sit for a few minutes. And then you can go back and work on what you were planning to work on. So let's get our second layer over here. I typically also work in a block, a watercolor block. I notice my paper is starting to buckle. You can tape it down with just tape on the edges if it buckles too much. I don't use enough water. My paintings aren't so saturated with water that I'm too worried about it buckling too much, but if you find your paper buckling too much, you can tape it down. Or, like I said, work in a watercolor block, and that's where they have waxed all the paper together on every edge, so it won't buckle. But for this painting, I cut it down, so I basically took it out of the block and then cut the paper down, so I could work a little bit smaller. Okay, that's layer number 2. Now, I think I'm going to go next, and I'm going to pick up some burnt sienna. And like I told you, I might use a little bit of red. I'm going straight for the red because my eye sees red. Let me see what color red this is. This is permanent orange, actually, but it looks very red. And I'm going to go to these areas down here, and I'm just going to add a little bit of burnt sienna where I see it in my reference photo. And that's kind of right around where we just picked up some paint, where the cactus meets the different parts of the cactus. This is still wet up here, so that's kind of adding a nice blending technique. Down here it's a little bit more dry, so I'm going to take some water and then I'm going to dot water over the paint. That's kind of a reverse technique. Instead of putting water down first and then dotting your paint in, I put the paint down and then I'm dotting water, and it's helping the paint spread. So, as you can see, now we have some nice we have some more unique color added to this painting. What I'm going to do next, I'm going to take that darker blue, ultramarine, and I see everything still feels slightly, it's a little bit more damp up here. I am going to take, there's almost this like shadow underneath these little white highlight spots. So I'm just going to take my brush and I'm just going to pull a little bit of this dark to it's like almost pulling to the bottom right. Starting with the more wet, because I kind of like the effect. Again, this is kind of me showing my true colors of how spontaneous I am as an artist, and then just how sometimes I don't plan well enough, but that's okay. That's just kind of my personality. And then this, see how the paint is not moving at all? That means it's very dry underneath. So then I'll do that reverse technique where I get the paint off my brush, and then I add the paint. I dot it on top of the dark spots to give it movement, so it doesn't just stay in one place. Okay. And then down here, it's going to be the same story. It's going to be a little more dry. So, it's actually a little bit more wet than I anticipated. I'm loving how these colors are merging down here. The siennas and the greens. Okay. See how it's just got this nice movement to the color, but you still see that left side slightly darker and even a little bit more dark. Okay, this part of the painting is where things really start to take off. I move pretty quickly when I get to this point. At the beginning, I'm really just moving slowly and cautiously where I lay the paint down, so I can clean up a mistake if I need to. But once I pretty much get the color and the shape and things where I want it to go, then I kind of pick up pace and I start adding darker darks, lighter lights. Lighter lights by adding darker darks. Okay, so this, I didn't really mention this, but this is a size 8 brush. I'm going to switch over to a little brush. It's a 0 for a little bit. I keep them in my top bun. It's a pretty convenient place. I am going to grab this dark green and then a little bit of burnt sienna. Then I'm going to go in and I'm just going to make the little dots, like where you would see this, needles of the cactus. Kind of playing out the color by feel as I go along. So I added some of that deep blue. Again, dotting the paint on. I guess you will probably never see me just wash, wash, wash. Most of the time I'm dotting paint. Occasionally I will. If it's like a background, you'll see me do washes. And I'm just laying these little, almost making a little semicircle. Checking my reference photo, seeing there's some on the edge, and they're going to be darker on the edge because remember our left side is our darker side. On the right side you might not be able to see it as much. Okay. Kind of gives you a nice, you see, I'm adding the ones on this very left side. I'm doing them outside of the line that I've created, almost to give you that illusion that it's three-dimensional and they're like popping off of the cactus. So I'm going to do the same thing here because I like how that looked. I think that was a phone vibrating. Hopefully my video is still going. Okay. All the way back up to the top. Now right underneath my painting hand, it is still wet. And so I immediately felt that. So I'm picking my hand up a little bit so I don't mess up my painting or blot the painting too much. Alright. I'm even adding some spots kind of spontaneously, just as I see them out on the paper. I'm adding balance. A lot of what I'm doing is kind of drawing technique. I'm adding, this one is still very wet, but I like how the paint is spreading really nicely. Oh, I think I added a little bit too much. So I'm going to go back. It spread a little bit too much, so it made those circles a little too big. But that's okay. I'm just going to blot that all up. Yeah, actually, may actually keep that lighter than darker. Okay, I'm going to go to these little parts right here. Where it meets the cactus, and it's almost a hard line of this sienna. Actually, I'm going to add a little burnt umber and a little blue. And it's a semicircular shape. I'm going to do it here as well. gonna hear Declan, and then my parents just walked in. They're gonna quarantine with us for a few days, so you might hear some whispers, some hand sanitizer spraying. Hey, right? We do what we can do. Alright. A little bit too dark. It's still a little wet over there. Down here is a little bit better. So, keeping this brush, I'm going to go back over those areas and just make them slightly darker. Now, the actual green part of the cactus is needing some more saturation. So, instead of doing this part just at the very end, like detailing at the very end, which I still do, but I like to detail somewhere in the middle of the painting because then I like to do some more washes over what I've detailed and then do my final detailing at the very end. Alright. This one, I think I actually want to keep this one lighter instead of darker. So in the reference photo, I have two different reference photos, and one of them it's darker. It's like one of them flipped this way and one of them flipped that way. One of them is dark, one of them is light, and I think I like the lighter one better. So I'm going to keep it light. And in the lighter one, we have this burnt sienna color instead of that deeper color, and it's very faint because the light is hitting it a little bit more strong. So I'm going to even dab that, but when you I added a little bit more pigment here on these little dots with less water, and so when I use my dab towel, you could still see them, and like when they were more saturated with water, they immediately went away when you dabbed them up. So that's kind of another technique that I use. More saturated paint, but then lifting, you still get a lot of that paint on your paper. Okay, I'm switching brushes again back to my 8. And this may be one of my last layers that I do. So I'm going to get a little bit darker. I think I'm going to add here a little bit of yellow. Again, I'm working around those highlight spots. And more color. And even though I've gone over some of those dark spots that I laid out earlier, do you remember when I did those dark spots underneath the highlight spots? You can't see those anymore, but it doesn't matter. That's part of the process in my mind where I am laying out what I want to do. So even though you can't see that anymore, it's already been established in my brush strokes and my plan for the painting, so then I can go back with even a darker color and add those spots while the paint is still dark. But even if you can't tell, you're working on the noises. You're working on layering slowly bit by bit. So even if something doesn't feel like if you've covered something up or if you can't see something that you did, it doesn't really matter because that's the beauty of watercolor. You're building on layers and it's adding to the painting whether or not you think it can or think it is. Adding that darker color, trying to leave, again, that light highlight around that line. Kind of forgot again. Paintbrush is getting a little bit dry. And if you can tell, I'm almost adding a thin, light line, but it still looks like a highlight. So it's almost this like light touched edge where you can see the light hitting it. It almost looks like the white, like if you look in the reference photo, you see this kind of whiter edge. Also see in my reference photo that burnt sienna on the edge a little bit more. So I'm just going to pick that color up, adding some interest. Okay, I can't quite leave this spot alone, so I'm switching back to my small brush, and I'm going to make that line a little bit more prominent. Go up here while this is dry. Okay. Back to what I was doing. Getting this edge a little bit darker. So I'm getting that ultramarine blue. Whoa. See there, got a little too saturated. I'm going to wait and see what it does because I liked the movement that it gave it. Surprised me a little bit. So I'm going to stand back, a little too dark, dab it up, but leave some of it. Go over here, press on. Add a little bit of yellow. Got a little bit too yellow actually, but I don't hate it, so I'm going to leave it. That's the beauty of this medium. Sometimes mistakes end up being something that you value in your painting that makes it unique. Look at that sea blue again, since I added so much yellow. Okay, I'm getting a little too saturated again, so I'm going to pull that paint down. I think I may have gotten it. Yep. Just going to pick up some of that color. Okay, we're almost nearing the end. I'm going to add that line like we did to the other one. I don't do this on every painting. This just works because it looks more like the highlight. I do not outline. I don't recommend outlining, but this does make this look like the highlight. Alright. I'm going to move up. We're nearing the end of this painting, and if you're like me, it's really hard to come to a stopping point. I could go on and on, adding, fixing, correcting, but at some point I have to stop myself, or I'll paint forever. Okay, let's add that line, so I'm going to get almost straight water with a tiny bit of pigment. It's probably too dark. Okay, so I'm basically just going to take some water and pull some of that paint on the edge. Same thing over here. And this one barely has any. Just going to put a few little green spots and then a little bit more of an edge. In fact, in the reference photo, there's almost this like that burnt sienna. My reference image. There is some of this sienna on the right side. And I'm going to tread lightly and I'm going to make it spotted or spotty. It's not just a straight line. I think these little areas of sienna add a nice interest, a nice coloring to the painting. Keeping my little dabbing napkin very close by. Okay, if the light's coming from this way, there's going to be a little bit of a shadow right here. I do not want to ignore that. So you're going to see a little bit of a darker green right here because the light is coming this direction and it's going to cast that shadow. I'm going to come back to it in a minute, add a little bit more of a line. Switching brushes again. I'm going to go back. Probably this is my last time to go back and highlight some of those details. Getting that deep ultramarine blue. Being sporadic but methodical. Not thinking too much. Doesn't have to be perfectly on that area. Give that a little bit harder of an edge. Still gonna soften it up on some parts of it. So here's that shadow I was talking about. That makes a little bit more sense now. Getting that line a little deeper. Still a little too wet over here, so that line is bleeding a little too much. I'm probably going to have to come back. Might not be in this video when I go back and add that line a little bit more harsh. The bottom of my paintings, now again this is just my stylized work. The very bottom of my paintings, since I leave this nice, I leave white background for a lot of my work that I do. Some of my work I do backgrounds. But I do let the bottom just kind of bleed into the paper. I don't do a hard line. I just make this nice loose brushy area. Sometimes I'll even pull it a little bit more and add some water and let it fade into the paper. I think that looks kind of cool. So, finishing up. And you can continue this. You can continue to go back and add details as much as you need to till you feel like your painting is complete. Is basically my process. Let's go back in and add the details just to this little cactus. Again, this is very concentrated pigment. Go in here, pull it up. And then one last thing. I'm just going to add this, not a full outline, but just some interest lines.